Revealed in upcoming episodes of this program are the contents of a recently unearthed repository classified by the secret government, the Phenomenon Archives.
On a humid August night in 1987, two high school seniors, Don Henry and Kevin Ives, while hiking in the woods of their nearby southern community, paid a terrible price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The facts in the case indicate that the two boys happened upon a transaction of some kind, involving a ring of longtime smugglers and billion-dollar drug profiteers. But the story doesn't end with the tragic deaths of these two young men, or the years of pain and suffering caused their families. Now the story takes a turn toward the dark corners of government, where lies are routinely sanctioned by powerful men.
You know, very early on we knew that there was local corruption in law enforcement.
And my parents received word that from a couple of law enforcement agencies that there was a hit contract out on my head.
While my head was turned, I heard what sounded like a gunshot.
If they can stick some garbage like this on me, then every American better be scared to death.
The risk in everything that you do in this line of work. That's why the pay is so good.
It's time for the American people to wake up and realize that unless they make government behave, that a very big criminal is going to join the ranks of the criminal, and that's called government.
If you think that the largest, most profitable business in the United States is the automobile industry or any other American mega corporation, you're wrong. The illegal drug business generates revenues of over $140 billion per annum, more than any of the largest multinational corporations. In the mid-1980s, cocaine and her evil sister crack flood the United States, the vicious tentacles of the drug trade penetrating deep into the heart of the country's inner cities. Though government lip service is given and appointments made, the drug czars and border patrols thrown at the problem cannot curtail the efforts of the country's largest and most enterprising of smugglers, the government itself. Why would members of the highest levels of government stoop to such base pursuits? The small town of Mena, Arkansas, may hold the key.
In August 1987, my son Kevin had spent the night with his friend Don Henry. And Don's dad had allowed them to go out hunting. The next thing we knew, we'd been told that they'd been run over by a train.
7th Judicial District Prosecutor Dan Harmon heads the initial grand jury.
The chief deputy at that time ordered the scene worked as an accident against all apparent police policy. They used the rear end of the train as a reference point in locating different evidence and things along the tracks. And of course, when the train left the scene, they had absolutely nothing.
We were told to work as an accident, or the investigators were told to work as an accident, and it was not enough time and emphasis put into it right there at the scene.
They literally fanned out about 4 deputies across and walked the point of impact to where the bodies were, and whatever they found, they simply dumped in black garbage bags. Their investigation was so thorough that they left my son's foot out there for 2 days in plain sight.
Arkansas's controversial chief medical examiner, Fahmy Malak, takes over the case. His friend, Jocelyn Elders, heads up the Arkansas Health Department. Both Malak and Elders are close friends and supporters of then-Governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton.
Well, the explanation that the medical examiner had 3 weeks after the deaths was that they had smoked massive amounts of marijuana, had simply fallen asleep on the tracks and didn't hear the train coming. One of the things that we knew at that time, and they were lying in identical positions across the tracks, and certainly didn't add up to the fact that they were stoned out of their minds. Everybody knew Kevin. He had a very good reputation as a good kid, was not known as some dope head, and certainly I think the fact that his father was a locomotive engineer was very troubling to many as to why he would lay down and rest on the railroad tracks. If he'd ever been cautioned about anything, it's the danger of trains.
As the investigation progresses, the Ives family receives more disturbing news.
We also had begun hearing rumors of a tarp covering the boys. We questioned the authorities about it and were told that it was simply an optical illusion. Later on, we learned that not only did the train crew see the tarp, they even took one deputy back to the point of impact, located the tarp, shined his light on it, and said, "There's the tarp that was covering the boys before impact of the train."
I knew it was some kind of a tarp. You know, it wasn't a bad body bag, because they had it, you know, more or less folded. And close as I can remember, they laid it down right there.
That tarp disappeared and has not been seen since.
Bombarded by conflicting evidence and lies, the families do their best to cope with their grief. Meanwhile, Dan Harmon slows and blocks the investigation in whatever manner possible.
It's been decided that there will be a gag order imposed on all 16 members of the grand jury, although one should not be necessary. Whatever comes out of it, if someone's charged or not charged, the grand jury has done a tremendous job.
We got absolutely no cooperation whatsoever from local or state officials. We were very frustrated and angry. We had been told to obtain court orders, which we did. The Little Rock Crime Lab defied a court order to supply the things that we were requesting in order to get a second opinion. Saline Memorial Hospital also defied a court order. And everywhere we went, we ran into a brick wall.
Dr. Miller, you know me.
I have work to do.
Dr. Miller.
This local news program breaks a story impugning the competence of the coroner, Fahmy Malak. Malak's friend and longtime associate, Jocelyn Elders, stands firmly behind him, blaming the press for irresponsible reporting.
I really feel that Arkansas owes Dr. Malak a great debt and a real apology.
Reports have also indicated that Malak lied in various trials when asked about his credentials.
And my record speaks for itself.
In an exclusive interview, Dr. Fahmy Malak denied allegations and defended his record.
I never lied under it. Never. Never. Never.
But not all of Malak's former co-workers hold the same confidence. Philip Kaplan represents Malak's former assistant, Dr. Lee Beamer. Beamer is suing Malak for allegedly firing him without proper cause. Beamer previously revealed that Malak testified about autopsies he never conducted.
And Dr. Malak admitted that although he testified under oath in a court proceeding involving a murder trial, that he had actually himself conducted an autopsy, that he was in the state of Mississippi having some car trouble while that autopsy was being performed.
Although Malak is no longer under a gag order by the Saline County Grand Jury, he has decided not to comment on any allegations against him.
Dr. Malak, people say that as state medical examiner you bungled cases and lied.
Sir, I told you before, like our president said, read my lips. I'm not going to comment.
According to an extensive review of court documents and trial testimony, Malak has been overturned in at least 3 medical cases. In total frustration, the families hired Dr. Joseph Burton, a nationally respected forensic pathologist, to perform a new autopsy on Don Henry and Kevin Ives.
The deaths of these two boys most probably were not accidental deaths, but that they met their death as a result of injuries inflicted on them by other people or another person.
Don Henry had been stabbed and Kevin was crushed in the face with the butt of a rifle, most likely.
Dr. Malek conducted autopsies on the two boys at the state morgue. But to the astonishment of experts who later conducted a second autopsy, Dr. Malek somehow failed to notice clear evidence of beating marks and a stab wound. But Dr. Malek never admitted making a mistake.
Was there a stab? The answer is no, they were not stabbed. Were they dead beforehand? Absolutely no, they were alive.
In addition to the controversy surrounding the deaths, dark rumors about illegal drugs circulate throughout the small community.
We began hearing things about drugs, drop sites and drops from trains. And
after nearly 2 years of botched investigations, blatant lies, false autopsies, and cover-ups, Linda Ives remains committed to uncovering the identity of the killers. She can't help but wonder who is going to all of this trouble to cover up the truth. Would a small town like Mena have so much meaning to drug lords and smugglers that they would risk mutilating and murdering two innocent young boys?
With all of the potential places for obscure drug drops in other states, perhaps even in states that are in a closer proximity to U.S. borders, why did Little Mena become so significant to the drug trade?
Russell Welch, an Arkansas State Police officer, begins working on the Criminal Investigation Unit in the early 80s. His first major assignment is to monitor suspicious flight activity at Mena Airport.
There are shops at the airport that do good work on aircraft, and it is small. There's not a tower on it, so it's not monitored, so it's an ideal spot for a smuggler to be able to find at the night at nighttime without having to worry about being recorded every time they come in and leave. It seems to be a nice centrally located field without a lot of monitoring, without a lot of law enforcement to bother them.
During the 80s, the most notorious drug smuggler in America was Barry Seal. Seal began his career as TWA's youngest pilot. His resourcefulness and talent soon earned him a place with the U.S. Army's Special Forces. Ultimately, Seal is recruited by the CIA for anti-Castro and anti-communist smuggling jobs in Central and South America. Seal's ties with the CIA protect him from the DEA, the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies. Gradually, he amasses a fleet of airplanes with a network of pilots and mechanics. He develops strong ties with the Medellin cartel, working on both sides of the law. In setting up drug stings and covert operations for government agencies, it is often said that Barry brings back a kilo for the feds and another for himself.
The local sheriff was passing information on about a cocaine smuggler from Baton Rouge by the name of Barry, whose planes were being stored out there. Gave a complete rundown. They were able to photograph activity at Rich Mountain Aviation, tail numbers being changed, the planes being handled in a suspicious manner, characteristic of what you expect from consistent with a smuggling operation. I knew that Barry Seal was working as an informant. I knew that he had been busted and had convicted in Florida and had rolled over, had become a snitch to stay out of prison. And I assumed that while he was working with federal agents in Florida, that they were protecting him from my investigation in Arkansas.
On April 15, 1985, President Reagan makes a speech relating his dismay over the situation in Nicaragua.
The history of this century forces me to believe that to do nothing in Central America is to give the first communist stronghold on the North American continent a green light to spread its poison throughout this free and increasingly democratic country.
1985 is also a significant year for Barry Seal's career.
1985, a DEA agent in Arkansas told me that he had been contacted by a friend of his in Mobile, Alabama, who said that Barry Seal was smuggling guns to Nicaragua and being allowed as a reward to fly back into country with a load of cocaine.
Among SEAL's highly efficient, tight-knit group of pilots is his closest friend and brother-in-law, Billy Bob Bottoms, an ex-Vietnam helicopter jockey. Keeping things all in the family, Billy Bob is entrusted as one of Barry's major cocaine pilots.
We had a light twin-engine airplane that was highly sophisticated with its electronics and the range capability. We could fly nonstop from the United States to Colombia. I would make the flight. I would take off usually in the middle of the night, fly to Colombia, land in Colombia, refuel, then I would pick up approximately six duffel bags of cocaine, which was around 300 kilos. I would fly back nonstop from Colombia to the United States, and I would make an airdrop.
SEAL's operation maximizes efficiency and secrecy. The drops are mechanically executed on a carefully contrived schedule, always conducted under a shroud of darkness.
We had a door modification that we could pull the door inside the airplane and move it out of the way. We had a roller track built on the floor. We built a pallet, an aluminum pallet, that we could put all 6 duffel bags in that aluminum pallet and fold sides up around the duffel bags and clip the top together. We had these harnesses that were hooked to each duffel bag and to a parachute. When the drop point approached, we would push it out the door with a static line hooked to the airplane, which would deploy the chute. Our altitude was usually around slightly less than 1,000 feet, to where when the chute opened, the merchandise hit the ground. The pallet system was designed such that when the merchandise hit the ground, it burst open, absorbing all the shock, and the duffel bags just lay on the ground. There was never any tumbling or damage to the merchandise.
You didn't need anybody's protection to fly an airplane into the United States and evade the radar. You didn't need protection for that. We did it routinely without any fear.
His efficiency and the freedom to operate out of a remote, virtually ignored location makes it easy for SEAL to generate a tremendous revenue stream. He spreads his cheer liberally with many local officials and Mena business owners, exchanging money for protection or their agreement to look the other way. None are interested in rocking the boat.
It is conservatively estimated that at the height of Barry SEAL's operation in the mid-'80s, planes were flying into Mena and other locations in the U.S. at the rate of 4 to 5 times a week. The cargo ranged from 300 kilos to 1,500 kilos a flight. And the street value of this deadly daily load would easily be worth $15 to $75 million. Marijuana, cocaine, and heroin were all freely smuggled in.
The stalled and mishandled investigations into Kevin's and Don's death reach a dead end. Even the nationwide coverage of network television series like Unsolved Mysteries and interest from 60 Minutes can't crack the shell of cover-up encircling the case. Rumors abound, but solutions are not at hand. Nearly 2.5 years after the train deaths, a federally mandated drug task force is established throughout Arkansas. A feisty prosecutor, Gene Duffy, is assigned to run the 7th Task Force.
I established a drug task force, and set it up, hired undercover officers, learned what I could to help the district get on its feet with investigation of drug activities in the district.
Instantly, one of her investigators reveals that the now infamous train deaths may be tied to a major drug smuggling ring operating out of Mena.
There were people who had been turning up dead who were possible witnesses in the train deaths case. I respected my undercover officer's instincts about the case, and I certainly gave him permission to go forward with an investigation. He said that there were drug drops coming from airplanes in that area, in the exact vicinity where Kevin and Don had been murdered. And these drug drops from airplanes had virtually not been investigated by any of the law enforcement agencies in our district.
Further investigation reveals numerous complaints by residents, informing police of low-altitude flybys occurring late at night.
Saline County Sheriff officer would go out, take the statement from the witness and then file the report. And there was actually no investigation. Now, these reports were there when Kevin and Don were murdered.
If the police are taking payoffs, Duffy knows that her team must gather evidence from the streets first.
I hired 7 undercover officers whose job it was to initially make street buys, work their way up the ladder into the suppliers eventually, and of course that's who we were after. And the connections that we made almost immediately led to several public officials. And the person whose name came up immediately and most frequently was Dan Harmon. We also developed an informant who was a confessed drug smuggler who told us that she had actually picked up a package of cocaine from that vicinity. She also had testified before the federal grand jury that she and Dan Harmon were lovers, but he was married at the time.
When Harmon, now newly elected county prosecutor, becomes aware of her investigation, the local press starts receiving false leaks discrediting Duffy and her task force.
The people who were immediately launched a campaign to discredit me and disband my task force was led by Dan Harmon. And of course it became apparent almost immediately that Dan Harmon was a key player in the drug smuggling, drug trafficking activity.
As county prosecutor, it is easy for Dan Harmon to file trumped-up charges against Gene Duffy.
My drug task force was shut down cold because we were getting too close. We were shut down actually before we could even get into our investigation, to the point where we had something significant to take to the grand jury in the way of asking for indictments.
Harmon succeeds in getting Duffy fired, after which he pursues her with a vengeance.
I didn't understand why 2 felony warrants were issued for my arrest when the warrants were illegal, because there was no felony charge. I knew there had to be some very powerful players behind what was happening.
In an unexpected twist, Harmon himself falls into trouble with the law.
Harmon was released from federal custody yesterday while he awaits his trial. You may remember just last Thursday, Harmon was jailed after refusing to take drug tests. Harmon maintains his innocence and says he's a victim of government harassment.
If they can stick some garbage like this on me, then every American better be scared to death.
Why should every American be scared to death? Was Harmon involved in a much larger illegal operation? Additional details of the Barry Seal story may help provide insights into the substance and magnitude of Harmon's statements. Although he has been in and out of jail and is constantly fighting the law, by 1985, Barry Seal is making so much money working with Pablo Escobar, Carlos Lader, and the Medellin cartel that his daily deposits into his bank are often more than $50,000. Some officials estimate that Seal's public and hidden assets are worth well over $5 billion. His most important asset, however, seems to rest in his uncanny ability to work within the margins of law enforcement. Louis Unglesby, then a young Baton Rouge attorney, represents Seal in his various entanglements with the law.
The documented evidence is that while Barry may have done some bad things, which I don't know that he ever did, but he certainly was being chased for them and convicted of at least 2 different events. When he got out of jail, he did a lot of things that the government couldn't do. And he brought into justice a lot of extremely bad people, very dangerous people, and very, very, very serious worldwide criminals.
Meanwhile, the Reagan administration is having difficulty convincing the American people and Congress to fund the Contra Army and their counterinsurgencies against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua.
The Soviets and Sandinistas must not be permitted to crush freedom in Central America and threaten our own security on our own doorstep. Now the Congress must decide where it stands. So tonight, I ask you to do what you've done so often in the past. Get in touch with your representative and senators and urge them to vote yes Tell them to help the freedom fighters. Help us prevent a communist takeover of Central America.
Reagan's anti-communist fervor proves useful to Barry Seal, because later that year, Barry's luck runs out. After several brushes with the law, he is busted for trying to fence $200,000 worth of Quaaludes in Fort Lauderdale. Released on bail and facing a 10-year federal sentence, Seal flies to Washington, D.C. and boasts to officials at the Drug Enforcement Agency that he can implicate the Nicaraguan Sandinistas in a cocaine smuggling operation. This meets with strong interest from representatives of the George Bush Drug Task Force and Reagan's point men in covert operations at the National Security Agency, Admiral Poindexter and his top aide, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Just weeks away from certain conviction, Seal finds himself a free man and back in the drug and arms delivery business. He convinces the CIA and DEA to fund over $40,000 worth of upgrades to his favorite freight aircraft, his C-123.
Once Oliver North and the CIA found out about the drug sting that the DEA was working on was in Nicaragua, he interjected himself into that drug sting.
With DEA and National Security Agency assistance, Seal enlists the help of his Medellin cartel connections in Panama and Federico Vaughn, a CIA operative in Nicaragua. Together they stage a drug delivery at a small crop duster field in Nicaragua. The photos that Seal takes have tremendous significance when Oliver North delivers them to President Reagan.
The Sandinistas have even involved themselves in the international drug trade. I know every American parent concerned about the drug problem will be outraged to learn that top Nicaraguan government officials are deeply involved in drug trafficking. This picture, secretly taken at a military airfield outside Managua, shows Federico Vaughn, a top aide to one of the 9 commandantes who rule Nicaragua, loading an aircraft with illegal narcotics bound for the United States. No, there seems to be no crime to which the Sandinistas will not stoop. This is an outlaw regime.
CIA operatives in Central America report back that Reagan's speech has effectively blown the cover on the Medellin cartel, which until that time had been moving their drugs primarily through the corrupt Panamanian government and the Contra leadership. The cartel quickly shifts its smuggling routes.
What Oliver North was trying to do was support the Contras. That's all he cared about. He didn't care about the Medellin cartel and what they could do or what they went on to do as a result of him blowing the cover on that operation. Had he not blown the cover on that operation, 3/4 of the Medellin cartel would have been arrested.
Within weeks, the cartel's operation is back in full swing. With the large inflow of drug profits that follows, the Reagan administration's Freedom Fighter Fund coffers are full enough to finance the development of Nella, Arkansas, a small airport and base camp a few miles from Mena. Here, the CIA trains and equips Contra insurgents.
The runway's right there. That's the runway. And that hill, there's electricity up there. In fact, you see a little shack there now. And we were going to build a camp there.
The gears of Seal's operation turn flawlessly. But in the illegal drug trade, nothing blows harder than the winds of change.
The story is there's a $350,000 contract on your life.
That's true. John, there's a risk in all covert operation work. There's a risk in everything that you do in this line of work. That's why the pay is so good.
In early 1986, the Reagan administration found itself embroiled in controversy. A Beirut newspaper broke a story about a secret arms deal between the United States and Iran. Profits from the sale of American tow missiles to Iran were being hidden in a Swiss bank account. These funds were used by Reagan's Red Guard, Admiral Poindexter and Oliver North, to fund the Contra operation in Nicaragua against the will of the Congress, the American people, and most importantly, against the letter of the Constitution.
With the controversial news leaks over Iran-Contra funds, public pressure on the administration increases and ultimately forces a reply.
What is involved is that in the course of the arms transfers, certain monies were taken and made available to the forces in Central America which are opposing the Sandinista government there.
Senator John Tower assembles a commission to study the covert operation. Rumors circulate that all involved will be subpoenaed to public hearing. One of the principals, however, will not be subpoenaed. Barry Seal is assassinated in February 1986 by hitmen allegedly sent by the Medellin cartel. At the time of his assassination, the FBI, DEA, and state and local New Orleans police were each tailing Barry, investigating one of several drug indictments. A local prosecutor, Sam Dalton, discovers how important Seal is to the FBI when they seize a trunk from Barry's car on the night of the assassination. The trunk allegedly has information linking Seal to the National Security Agency, CIA Director William Casey, and other high officials in Washington.
If it hadn't been for a good state judge with enough courage to back the federal government up, we'd have never gotten inside that trunk. He made them give us that trunk back. Obviously, they had ransacked that trunk and some of the things we didn't get back, but they had missed a few things that indicated just how valuable that trunk was.
3 months later, another international embarrassment plagues the Reagan administration. On October 3, 1986, Barry Seal's infamous Fat Lady, now in use by the CIA, is shot down by Sandinista gunners over southern Nicaragua. The plane is loaded to the gills with weapons and supplies for the Contras. 3 American crewmen are killed, and a 4th, Eugene Hasenfuss, is captured.
My name is Gene Hasenfuss. Marinette, Wisconsin.
The people involved were not from our military, not from any U.S. government agency, and CIA included.
CIA activities involving Eugene Hasenfuss date back to the agency's 60s drug smuggling operations in Laos under the infamous Air America Corporation. Following his arrest, Sandinista officials find concealed in his uniform the phone numbers for CIA operatives in Nicaragua, for the National Security Agency, and a direct line to the offices of then Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush. The Sandinista government sentences Hasenfuss to 30 years for arms smuggling. Within a month, he is mysteriously pardoned and released. In 1987, as Congress investigates the covert Contra operation, drugs and Contra resupply operate freely out of Mena. Despite constant monitoring by federal and local agents, payoffs and kickbacks effectively prevent any arrests.
Every afternoon when I was working out, I was seeing Oliver North answer questions. It was his turn, and he was answering questions to the subcommittee. And I thought, well, these guys are telling me something illegal is going on here because Congress is investigating it as illegal activity. But had been overloaded on the Barry Seal thing. It just wore me into ground. I was way out of my league, and I wasn't getting any help from anybody.
Admiral Poindexter and Lieutenant Colonel North are sent packing as the Iran-Contra hearings draw to a close. Only a few weeks before Kevin and Don are murdered, Russell Welch observes some interesting developments.
In August of 1987, 2 FBI agents came here to Mena, asked to meet with me, agents that I'd known and worked with for years, and told me that they had just received word that Southern Air Transport had moved its operation from Miami to Mena. But out of nowhere, C-130 appeared at the Mena airport. It was the same month that the boys were killed that the agents came to me.
Southern Air Transport, a CIA front since the 60s, continues the nighttime drop into Mena even after the deaths of Kevin and Don.
With no support from state, federal, or even local authorities, Linda Ives and Gene Duffy continue their search for missing clues related to the murders, even though it's obvious to them that the marching orders for the drug activity come from on high, from people who have never even heard of the train deaths or the names of the 2 young men, Kevin Ives and Don Henry. No one wants to jeopardize that heavenly flow of money, even if it is drug money.
The first investigation, of course, was the Saline County Sheriff's investigation led by James Steed. It was very apparent that he was covering up information, suppressing information, and certainly was part of the cover-up initially. When Dan Harmon was appointed special prosecutor, He led a county grand jury investigation, which was nothing more than several months of orchestrated cover-ups where several witnesses turned up dead.
And when the state police got involved, we were ecstatic because we thought that finally somebody was going to get to the bottom of what was going on in Saline County.
Another investigation that was nothing more than a sham was the Arkansas State Police investigation. They now have a file that is almost 3 feet high. Only about an inch of that file reflects interviews that were actually conducted, and it is nothing more than a sham.
And then there was a 1990 federal investigation, and we were in fact promised indictments out of that 1990 federal grand jury investigation. And suddenly, when Chuck Banks shut that investigation down in June of '91, without prior warning, we were devastated, because who has the power to shut down a federal investigation?
I didn't understand then why the U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks shut down the federal investigation and cleared Dan Harmon. And this was in spite of that grand jury unanimously wanting to indict Dan Harmon.
6 years after the incident, an eyewitness to the murders reveals himself to Linda Ives.
Linda Ives turned this witness over to a local investigator who took him to the FBI. The FBI immediately put this witness into protective custody, gave him a polygraph test, which he passed, and opened their investigation.
Where we didn't realize there was anybody else out there at first. We were, just like I said, goofing off. We come up on, or didn't really come up on, we noticed there were people on the track. Saw a flashlight come on and then go back off. They weren't looking in our direction, but we could see the light. And so we kind of quieted down and snuck up a little bit closer to see what was going on, and there was 5 individuals standing on the tracks. One thing that struck my curiosity is, at the time my mother was dating an attorney named Dan Harmon. I knew him well enough to recognize him. There were 2 more individuals that a few minutes after we got there were walking down the railroad tracks. They had a rifle and what looked to be a flashlight, and they were more or less kind of minding their own business. And when they realized someone else was on the tracks, they stopped and was fixing to turn around when someone, or Danny, motioned for them to come closer over to where they were. They hesitated and eventually ended up walking on towards the rest of the group. While my head was turned, I heard what sounded like a gunshot. I saw a flash, as you would expect with a gunshot at night. We were pretty much terrified and bolted and ran.
Other witnesses corroborated that evidence.
I know that Dan Harmon went down there because I was down the road from there. It's in an automobile. I do know that a drop was made. I've absolutely 100% unequivocally made there that night.
The only positive note in the ongoing investigation is that the law finally catches up with Dan Harmon.
Court definitely wasn't in session in this Benton courtroom this morning, but instead a farewell party for Saline County Prosecutor Dan Harmon, who says he's headed to Gulfport, Mississippi to live.
It's time to move on to another chapter and do something different. Enjoyed about all this I can stand.
Shortly after Harmon's resignation, he is indicted and convicted on a number of tax evasion, drug, and racketeering counts.
After 2 days of deliberations, the jury found Harmon guilty of 5 of 11 counts, guilty of drug charges, racketeering, and extortion.
In November of 1995, Linda and Larry Ives insisted on having a meeting with the FBI in charge of the Little Rock office, who told Linda and Larry that after an exhaustive FBI investigation of 18 months, they had no evidence of anything, and they should consider that a crime had not been committed.
Every stalled or dropped investigation prolongs the misery felt by the families of these 2 lost boys. Because there is no closure, there can be no peace. Working independently, Linda and Jean occasionally turn up new evidence about the train deaths. Louis Unglesby, former attorney for Barry Seal, makes a startling revelation about his former client. When Barry died, he was being pursued by the IRS for unpaid taxes estimated at over $80 million.
I was going to court and arguing all the time for different issues involving Barry because I felt like they really were guilty of a lot of misconduct in the manner in which they were investigating him, not knowing about his involvement in the government. In the course of that, it was a lot of work for me, it was a lot of work for the prosecutors here, and one of them said to me, why don't you just tell Barry to call in the cavalry and we won't have to worry about this anymore. I didn't know what he was talking about, so I asked Barry. And as a result, and, you know, in asking him, he said, okay, I won't tell you much, but let me show you, just call this phone number. So he gives me this phone number, I call the phone number. That's when we talked to Vice President Bush's office. So then they put this admiral on the phone, or they put somebody who said he was an admiral on the phone. And then I told him who I really was, and he was nonplussed by that and hung up. And then I said, you know, now Barry, really, I'm confused. So Barry called back. And they, you know, they just exchanged a little greeting, and Barry apologized to him for having me call.
Well, the only thing I can conclude is because they were talking to each other very seriously over probably what was a secured phone number, a secured phone. And Barry Seals was in direct contact with Bush. That's why I say he had Bush pretty well conned.
In its desperation to finance a clandestine underground war, the Reagan administration was already dealing with terrorists in Iran. Why not drug lords in Colombia? Barry Seal was clearly connected to men occupying the highest offices in the land. With prosecutor Dan Harmon, allegedly Seal's local operative, indicted, the guilty finger was taking a turn toward government.
It's time for the American people to wake up and realize that unless they make government behave and do right, they're going to lose their freedoms, and on the premise that government can solve the crime problem if they give up their freedom. And the American people's got to realize that they're going to wind up with both. They're going to wind up with the loss of their freedoms, and they're still going to have the crime problem. The only difference is going to be that a very big criminal is going to join the ranks of the criminal, and that's called government.
The murderers of Kevin and Don may never be brought to justice. If their deaths are related to government impropriety, then there the stain of shame shall remain. The drugs flowing out of Mena, Arkansas have destroyed many lives. But the extent of misery, waste, and destruction suffered as a result of the cocaine, crack, and other drugs that freely transverse our borders will not be stopped through any just say no rhetoric, unless the government says no first.
They could shut the borders of this country down tomorrow morning so tight that not 1 gram of cocaine could get inside this country.
The lives of those involved with the train deaths have changed. While Russell Welch was working on his Mena airport investigation, he was slowly poisoned with anthrax through a series of tainted letters sent to his office. He nearly died, and his kidneys and immune system were almost totally destroyed. He is retired from the force. Jean Duffy was publicly defamed and her career ruined by Dan Harmon and the local press, despite the credible evidence she was gathering with her task force. She now works as a high school teacher. As for Kevin and Don and their families, tragically, there is no amount of money or justice that can ever compensate for the loss of a child.
The only thing I'm interested in is my son's murder on August 23rd of 1987, and I just want his killers brought to justice.
A mother's grief has led us down the path of discovery, though we may never know who was directly responsible for the deaths of the Ives and Henry boys. We're confronted once again with a larger and perhaps more pressing question. How do we respond when our government, be it local, state, or federal, turns a blind eye toward and even becomes a party to corruption? Though we've searched tirelessly, we've found no answer to this question in the Phenomenon Archives.